If your study has a limitation, it's better to acknowledge it upfront. As a consequence, what happened was that collaborator withdrew, and therefore it was costly for both.
How do you go about choosing the journal you want to submit?
They do detail out the scope, and you should not submit something to a journal which is not within its scope. If your paper does not cite any journal at all, you should not target that journal. You should not compromise on the quality, but at the same time, it is also important that you should get an R&R at least before you pass out. You should not work on only one paper. You should have a pipeline. If an article is not written well, it stands very less chance of getting through in the refereeing process. But that one error can be a fatal error.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Decoding Ph.D. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Varun Jindal, a distinguished academic from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Professor Jindal specializes in corporate finance, mergers, acquisitions, and seasoned equity offerings. With a Ph.D. from IIM Calcutta and an impressive career spanning academia and corporate world, including roles at KPIT and Infosys. Professor Jindal brings a wealth of knowledge and practical insights to his teaching and research. His papers have been published in the Journal of Corporate Finance, the British Accounting Review, the European Financial Management, and the International Business Review. He is the recipient of several awards and honors, including the Excellence in Teaching Award at IIM Bangalore, the Distinguished Alumnus Award 2021 by Punjab University Alumni Association, the Springer Best Discussant Award at the Emerging Markets Conference 2021, and the Satish K. Sehgal Doctoral Student Award for Excellence in Scholarship and Organization Citizenship 2020 at IIM Calcutta, among others. He is also a recipient of financial support of close to $4,000 for a policy paper under NAC NYU Stern Initiative on study of financial markets in India in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Professor Varun Jindal. Thank you, Professor, for taking out time to join us today and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Sanchit, for having me.
Let's just dive in directly. Professor, for our viewers today, can you please briefly summarize what your paper is about?
Okay, before I talk about this paper, so let me tell you what the research gap was that this paper actually addressed. So prior literature talked about underperformance of stock financed acquisitions relative to cash financed ones. Now, why do stock financed acquisitions underperform relative to cash financed ones, right? So prior literature says that it is possibly due to adverse selection effects that are associated with stock issues.
Right.
So essentially, when a company issues stock to investors, it sends a signal to investors at large that the company is issuing stock perhaps because the stock is overvalued. And given this signal, investors at large drive down the stock price of this company. And this is what is called as the adverse selection effect of stock issues. Having said that, it is not very clear as to whether the underperformance of stock financed acquisitions that are paid for in stock is actually due to adverse selection effect of stock issues, or is it because of something else? And that is what we actually address in this paper. We use a setting wherein we exploit acquisitions which have the same set of insiders on both the acquirer and the target side. And therefore, there is no information asymmetry in these acquisitions because of sharing of overlapping insiders. And what we find is that indeed, the underperformance of stock financed acquisitions is actually due to adverse selection effects of stock issues. And we also go on to addressing another important aspect as to how information asymmetry between the transacting parties, acquirer and target in this case, affects the method of payment in acquisitions. We do find that when the information asymmetry is low, acquisitions are more likely to be financed with stock. And this is consistent with prior literature, but we do this using a new proxy of overlapping insiders. So that is actually what we study in this paper.
So how did you get the idea about this paper? Like, what were you exactly doing? What moment this inspiration of this paper came in?
I was working on a related paper, and I was presenting that paper in a couple of conferences. One of my discussants, in one of the conferences, he suggested me this idea as an extension of my older paper. And I thought that why to incorporate it as part of the existing paper? Why not have a new paper? And that is when I started working on this idea. And of course, the original idea was a small piece, but we extended it into a larger piece. And that's how actually I sort of started working on this. So sometimes ideas come from discussions with others.
And going to conferences is important.
Yes, of course, of course. You not only get new ideas, it helps you shape up your existing research. It also helps you network, more importantly, with well-known researchers, and you understand a lot more about the research process.
Once we have the idea, the next step is doing a thorough literature review. Now there are so many papers, so many journals available, and there are new papers, new issues coming out every month, every year. So how does one really go about this process? What is the structure that maybe one should follow?
Once a person or once a researcher has identified a research gap, to know actually whether it is actually a research gap, I think, of course, as you suggested, one has to undertake a literature review to ensure that this research has not been carried out in the past. So you can look at some of the recent papers in the same area, and they will give you perhaps a good picture of what has already been studied in the literature, what is being looked at in the literature, and also sometimes you can look at review papers. So review papers will present a summary of a particular strand of literature, and I think that is where this is actually comes in handy to know whether a research question has been already addressed in the prior literature or not. So that is what I actually looked at.
When you started with this idea, what was the initial design in your mind that this is how perhaps you can go about this paper? And how did that actually translate to when you were executing this?
Okay, first of all, you have a lot of hypotheses initially, right? But when you start executing them, when you start executing your hypothesis or prediction, you realize that some of those predictions actually do not hold. And then you have to look for an alternative story, or you have to find out reasons as to why you are not getting the results. What is the alternative story? And you have discussions with your supervisors, with your peers, with other researchers at conferences, and that's how your story gets shaped up. And I think all these components, discussion with peers, discussion with supervisors, discussion with researchers at conferences, have been instrumental in shaping my research.
That's interesting to know. Let's say now we have some hypotheses and we're working on them. So what kind of challenges did you face during this research execution phase?
I think another important challenge which I faced with respect to executing this research was with respect to the sample size. The sample size of the study was less than 300 acquisitions, and that too in the Indian setting. We knew that this is a huge challenge because many of the journals will essentially discourage small sample kind of studies. This is something we knew beforehand, and this is exactly what happened when we started submitting this paper to journals. Some of the journals came back and told us that, your sample size is too small. It has been carried out in the Indian context. How do we know that your findings are going to be applicable for other studies? So therefore, this was one of the most important challenges we faced. And of course, other challenges could be you have done it in the Indian context. It may not be of interest sometimes to the global audience, and especially to referees who are typically, let us say, US or from the European countries. So therefore, that's another challenge to convince them that our setting is something which provides novel insights.
So how did you overcome these challenges? The data limitation, of course, since your topic is very niche, so data is bound to have that kind of a issue.
If your study has a limitation, I think it's better to acknowledge it upfront. Of course, this is something which we cannot overcome. For example, if the sample size is small, we cannot increase the sample size. There are constraints on the sample. So therefore, in such a situation, what one can do is one can actually acknowledge the limitation upfront. And that is what we exactly did. And therefore, reviewers do not pose this question with as much intensity as they would have posed had we not acknowledged this limitation in the paper.
So don't wait for the reviewer to get to you. Instead, you go ahead and...
Yes. That's the mantra. Getting your paper into a journal through not so unfavorable feedback from reviewers.
So our viewers, the link to the paper is available in the video description. So make sure you check out the paper from there. So continuing with this, we also talk about collaborations in these kind of papers, since research is not usually an individualistic journey, especially when it comes to paper writing. So how do we go about choosing a collaborator?
Now, there are a couple of ways that I can think of when you have to choose a collaborator. So the first is you can latch on to the network of your co-author. For example, let us say your co-author is a supervisor. Your supervisor will have some network, and you can consult your supervisor and see if there is somebody who has done research in a similar area or in the same area whose inputs can prove helpful for your research. So that is one way to choose your collaborator. The second way to choose your collaborator is you visit, for example, let us say an international conference. You go to an international conference, you try to discuss your research with other people, and you might find some like-minded people who are well published in your area. That's another way to choose your collaborator. And the third way is, similar to carpet bombing. What it means is that you essentially start dropping emails to well published researchers one by one, of course not at the same time, one by one. You attach in your emails your research proposal and your preliminary results if these are available, and that could be another approach. This approach, of course, will have very high rejection rate. Not many are willing to collaborate remotely without having looked at you, without having met you. But of course, these are the three ways I think in general one can collaborate with potential international researchers.
So one quick follow-up on the third method which you suggested. So sending emails to multiple potential collaborators. So how long do you think one should wait before sending the first email, not getting a response, and sending the second email?
No, I think it's important to close the loop. If the person has not responded whom you actually approached initially, it's better to send a follow-up email. And if the person still does not respond, you should wait for another week or 10 days. And after that only you should approach somebody else. Otherwise, what is going to happen is that, let us say the person reverts, right? Because it takes some time for the person to go through your idea, right, your proposal, right? So you should give the person some time, and also you should send a follow-up email or a reminder, so that even if the person, despite everything, if the person does not respond, only then you should approach the subsequent researcher in your lineup.
So in this case, do we also send an email to the initial contact that we are perhaps moving on, something on those lines? Do we send an email to the person we reached out to initially, or do we not need to do that?
Finally, to close the loop, you are saying,
Yes.
You can do that, or you may choose not to do that, because sometimes it's reasonable that if the person has not responded even after your follow-up email, let us say after 10 days, it's reasonable to assume that the person is perhaps not interested, or even if that person is tied up. So in that case, you can assume that the person is not interested. I think that's what I would advise personally. Of course, it may vary from person to person. You may also say that you are moving ahead, but yeah, it may not sound very nice.
It's true. Yeah. A lot of PhD students are also on the fence of whether to go for foreign collaborators or not. So what's your take on that?
One must take into account both benefits as well as costs of collaboration. Collaboration comes at a cost. There are several costs one should be cognizant of. For example, if you collaborate with somebody, that collaborator might have set of expectations. That collaborator may be willing to only target top journals. For you, it might be your one of main research papers. And what if your collaborator ditches you and says that, no, this paper cannot get into a top tier journal and therefore I'm not willing to work with you. So there is a risk. And also in addition to that risk, there is also a risk of delay, because
Right.
when you work with somebody, that person may not respond immediately to all your emails. There could be some time delays. Also, the person might want you to work on certain aspects before the paper can be submitted to a journal. So again, it has a lot of delays. So that these are the costs. But on the benefit side, you get a lot of benefits also. For example, that person may have his or her own network, which may help you or which may give you a slight advantage over others when the paper goes through the referring process. Also, the person may give you a lot of inputs as to how to revise the paper to get it in better shape so that it has a better chance of receiving a favorable review outcome. One has to take a call based on the potential benefits and costs of collaboration.
Typically, when we are reaching out to one potential foreign collaborator, what are the things we should definitely mention in an email? Like, obviously, we are talking about what the broad research proposal is, but what are the other things which can potentially help us tilt the scale in our favor?
When you reach out to somebody for collaboration, it goes both ways. So first of all, what is in it for the person who is approaching the collaborator? And the second is what is in it for the collaborator who is going to collaborate with you, right? So it has to be win-win for both the sides, and only then it makes sense. So a person may be willing to collaborate with you because you have a very good research question and data to address that research question. And perhaps you have also carried out some preliminary results which support your hypothesis. So when you try to approach a collaborator, you should highlight your research question. How is it novel? What is the research gap that you are addressing? How is it novel? How is it going to add to literature? And what are your preliminary results? Are they supporting your hypothesis or not? So I think these kind of things can tilt the scales in your favor as far as closing the loop with your potential collaborator is concerned.
So students also have this kind of a hesitation, let me say, when reaching out, because there could be time differences when reaching out to foreign collaborators. There could be cultural differences. What are acceptable practices? So how does one overcome that, and how does one get more information about these things?
No, I think another thing I have realized is sometimes our cultural barriers, they stop us from being frank with the collaborators. But I have seen that frankness never hurts. It's important to be upfront and clear with the collaborator as to how things stand on the ground. For example, I'll tell you one incident. I went to a conference in Romania and I was talking to somebody who was well published, and his collaborators were researchers of Pakistani origin. So now this collaborator suggested them something to do. And these researchers, they did something. After some time, the collaborator realized that even though these people had done that thing, but after some iterations, they removed some portion from their paper without consulting the collaborator. So he was in a state of shock as to why did they do this. Even though those people, the researchers, they were very, very respectful because of their culture. Maybe they did not want to confront the collaborator that, this is something which is not going to be very helpful in the review process. I think they should have been upfront. As a consequence, what happened was that collaborator withdrew
Oh,
withdrew from that research, and therefore it was costly for both, right?
very costly.
Very costly. So therefore, I think it's important when PhD students reach out to potential collaborators, they should actually be upfront and clear. And as I told you, being upfront and being frank never hurts. It's helpful.
That's really good advice. Once you have finalized on a project, you have collaborators on board, you are ready to go. How do you go about choosing the journal you want to submit to?
So I think you can leave this job to your collaborator if that collaborator is an experienced person. Also, you can look at the scope of the journals. You can go to the journal website and check out its scope. They do detail out the scope, and you should not submit something to a journal which is not within its scope. And thirdly, nowadays you also have journal selection tools available from Elsevier, available from Wiley, and maybe many other publishers. So you can go to these journal selection websites and you can try to find out, for example, put in your keywords and the abstract. The website is going to suggest you some potential journals, and you can think which journal is actually coming in that search. And finally, you can also look at the references that you have cited in your paper, right? So if your paper does not cite any journal at all, you should not target that journal. So that could be another tip in my view.
Because that is a conversation we are continuing. So depending on the conversation, we would want to enter the same journal.
Right, that's correct.
So another aspect which at PhD student stage one may be concerned about is whether to maybe go for a relatively lower quality journal or to target high quality journals, because again the time that is required there is much longer. So should one just try for one quick publication so that there is something available as you go out in the job market, or should one target high quality journal?
I would say there is a trade-off between quality and quantity. There are some institutes, for example, in India, which look at the number of publications, of course, above a certain threshold. On the other hand, there are several institutions which look at the quality of papers. So I think my own view is that you should not compromise on the quality, but at the same time, it is also important that you should get an R&R at least before you pass out. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to get a job of your liking. Or not even just liking, get a reasonable job itself might be a challenge. So there's a trade-off. I would say that depending on the institutions that you want to target, you should decide your journals accordingly, right? If you want to target a top-tier institution, obviously that institution will have preference towards quality journals. And therefore, if you, for example, undersell your work by targeting a lower-tier journal, that may not help you for that institution.
So once we submit our work to a journal, so there is a review stage, so whereby reviewers get back to us with critical feedback. So how do you handle these kind of feedbacks, especially in case where they require some major changes?
If you receive a revise and resubmit decision, it's a hugely positive news, because it's rare to receive a revise and resubmit news. So you should do all what that it takes to address the comments of the referees. So essentially, what I believe is that once you get a revise and resubmit, or R&R as we call it commonly, the ball is in your court. Now, it is up to you whether you want to publish your research in that journal or not. If you want to publish your research in that journal, you should do all what that it takes to execute or to address the comments that your referees have given you. So once you address those comments, I think so referees are likely to give a favorable response to you in the next round. And your paper will ultimately have a much higher chance of getting publication subsequently.
Suppose, for instance, if we get a rejection, so how does one deal with rejections in this
Okay,
case?
if you get a rejection, of course, it is disappointing. Of course, there's no doubt about it. But it also gives you avenues to improve your paper. If your paper has undergone the refereeing process, if your paper has not been desk rejected, you will get some feedback from the referees. So you should address all those comments which are possible to address, right? Of course, I understand that there could be some comments which are not addressable, but the comments which are addressable, you should try to address them before you submit your paper to another journal, because it may so happen that you may encounter the same referee who reviewed your paper at a previous journal, and if that referee actually sees that that you have not worked on the comments that he or she provided, he or she will straight away reject your paper, right? So I will tell you, for example, in the case of my bar paper, that paper was rejected previously at another journal, and one of the referees had given us some comments, and we did work upon those comments to improve the paper accordingly. And once we submitted this paper to British Accounting Review, we realized that we also got the same referee. One of the two referees was the same referee who had previously reviewed our paper. And he was, or he or she, we don't know who the person was. So he or she was impressed to note that we had addressed most of his comments, if not all. And as a consequence, he recommended or she recommended an R&R. So it is very helpful if you, for example, address the comments which your referees have given you, even if it is a rejection, therefore.
That makes a lot of sense. There's also a challenge of very long wait times. So sometimes we submit a paper, we keep on waiting for the reviewers or the editor to get back. So while we are doing this, how do you manage this wait time?
No, of course, I understand that it can be quite annoying to wait endlessly for the review outcome. But having said that, there is no resort. You have to wait. There is no other possible solution. So therefore, what I would recommend is that you should not work on only one paper. You should have a pipeline. You should have multiple projects. Therefore, once you submit a paper, it is not under your control. You can't do much about that work. So therefore, what I suggest is that in the meantime, you should start working on your other papers. So because publication takes several years, so therefore, you should not waste your time just waiting for the outcome of the review process.
That's a great suggestion actually, to have multiple projects. But I think it also comes with a cost of having to manage multiple projects together. So some words of wisdom on that.
Okay. So to be very frank, I think I'm not very good at multitasking myself. Of course, as you said, working on multiple projects has its own set of problems. There are own set of challenges which come with multiple projects. Of course, you should prioritize those projects which have a greater chance of publication in high quality outlets. So therefore, sometimes you have to prioritize. And when you have to prioritize, you should prioritize that work which is going to give you more benefits.
Coming back to your paper, so usually one thing which I really enjoy about your papers is the fluidity with which it is written, and it's quite an easy read. So please share some thoughts on that.
Okay, I think writing is one of the most crucial aspects of an article. If an article is not written well, it stands very less chance of getting through in the refereeing process. So therefore, an article has to be well written. That is something which is a hygiene factor. But having said that, it is easier to find a lot of faults. A comma here or there can also make some difference, right? So for example, even though we found that our paper was very well written, but one of the referees pointed out a mistake in the very first sentence of the paper. He or she based his or her comment about the quality of writing in the paper based on that single sentence. He mentioned to us that a paper has a lot of grammatical mistakes, while it was only one error, but that one error can be a fatal error. So therefore, one has to proofread the paper a number of times or get it copy edited from a professional copy editor to ensure that the paper is free from typo errors, grammatical errors. And these errors, as I told you, can sometimes prove fatal.
First impressions do last long.
Yes, indeed.
So that was definitely an interesting paper. So what's next? What are you currently working on?
Okay, currently, as I told you, one should not wait for the review outcome. So therefore, what I'm doing is, along with my teaching, I am working on some projects. Some of these projects, or rather many of these projects, are with PhD students. And therefore, sometimes I have to take a call which projects to prioritize. And therefore, I do prioritize projects which I feel have a greater chance of publication in a quality outlet. So, of course, for example, I am working with PhD students on green bonds, seasoned equity offerings, and also on mergers and acquisitions, especially with reference to earnouts, and also how does information asymmetry affect, for example, the use of earnouts in acquisitions.
A very, very in-depth insight into corporate finance area.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very broad area. It has several strands which one can address.
Before you conclude, your words of advice for our PhD students on improving their research, improving their writing.
Yeah, no, I think to improve one's writing, first of all, one has to read carefully papers that have been published in top tier journals and see how those papers have been structured, especially how the introduction section has been written. For example, in our discipline, in finance and accounting discipline, there is a peculiar way of writing the introduction section. First couple of paragraphs talk about what the research gap is about, how does the study address that research gap, and why is it important to study that research gap. Then they go on to talk about findings of the study, the contributions that the paper makes to different strands of literature, and finally how the rest of the paper is structured. And also, for example, if you carry out some study in the Indian context, it is important that you highlight as to why that study has been carried out in the Indian context, because journals generally do not take it lightly if the study has been carried out in a context other than the US or let's say European context. And nowadays, in fact, even Chinese context is becoming popular.
Right.
So therefore, I think for a PhD student, writing is the key, and therefore they should read papers that have been published, and they should try to imitate the writing style of those papers which have been published. They should read extensively, they should write extensively, they should also code extensively. I think that's what I will suggest to PhD students.
The more practice, the better it is.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. This was once again very, very helpful, and I'm sure our audience will quite appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, indeed a pleasure to interact with you.
And once again, the link to the paper is available in the video description, so make sure you check it out. Well, that was today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. We'll keep coming up with more content which will help you on your journey in PhD. Please leave us your feedback in comments and also suggestions for what you would like to see on our show. Thank you and all the best.